All right, so I wanted to just quickly cover like the week 4 lab quiz review. It'll actually cover endocrine physiology. Okay, we've talked about endocrine system all week, and so I just wanted to focus on this honestly, and not bring in new material. So remember the endocrine system, right? Just remember all things endocrine, really. So firstly, let me just talk about the classes of hormones. Classes of hormones, right? So these are going to be peptide hormones, right? So they're basically a short protein, essentially. So all those hypothalamic, all those pituitary gland hormones, right? Most of the hormones in the body, they're going to be peptide based, right? Like the insulin, for example, glucagon. However, we also have amino acid derivative hormones, right? Coming from the amino acids tyrosine and tryptophan. Tryptophan is going to be able to make that melatonin produced by the pineal gland, whereas the tyrosine amino acids, they're going to be able to produce like the thyroid hormones, right? As well as the epinephrine and norepinephrine too, right? But they're going to be amino acid hormones. And then we have the last class of hormones being those steroid hormones, right? Those steroid hormones are going to come from that backbone of cholesterol. And remember, steroid hormones are only going to be produced by the adrenal glands and the gonads, right? And so we'll talk about those adrenal gland hormones in just a second too. But remember, they're going to come from that precursor cholesterol, okay? So you got to remember that, okay? So let's talk about the hypothalamus first, right? So I'll give you, for example, 2 examples, but I want you to remember all of them, of course, right? And just remember we did it in our, our hypothalamus, right? It's going to go down that hypothalamic pituitary, or that hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, I should say, right? And it's going to send those hormones to the anterior pituitary gland, and from the anterior pituitary gland is going to go to like a peripheral organ, right? So for example, let me do, the one we always like to talk about, right? There's a couple, right? But the hypothalamus will produce TRH, right? Thyrotropin releasing hormone, right? That goes down that portal system, tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH. That's thyroid stimulating hormone. It's also called thyrotropin, right? But then the anterior pituitary releases TSH to then go to the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland can produce its hormones, T3, T4, for example, right? And so you got to remember that follow through. And also remember, for example, if I put growth hormone releasing hormone, goes down the portal system, tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone, right? And so growth hormone is then going to go to really just the tissues of the body, right? But it's going to stimulate, for example, bone growth, right? And like we mentioned in class, it's going to stimulate the production of insulin like growth factors, right? That will stimulate growth in bones and in muscle cells and muscle tissue, right? So you can grow. Let's talk about one more actually, okay? Let's talk about CRH, right? Corticotropin releasing hormone goes down, tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone. That then goes where? Obviously, it's going to go to the adrenal cortex and tell the adrenal cortex to release its cortex hormones, right? Those cortex hormones, such as, for example, it's really going to be cortisol, right? So let's just say cortisol, right? Because the aldosterone, that's going to be, in a sense, really regulated by that RAS system, okay? But we'll see it in this pathway right here, that HPA axis, right? The hypothalamic, anterior pituitary, adrenal axis. Okay, so remember those pathways for me. okay? Because those are going to be really, really important for you to remember, okay? So let's go out of here. Let's go to the next slide. So I want you to focus on thyroid gland and adrenal cortex gland, right? Understand the disorders too, right? So the thyroid gland, number one, is going to be able to produce the T3, T4, and calcitonin, right? So remember the functions of these as well, okay? You need iodine in the diet to be able to make T3, T4, okay? Because they have, right, T3, triiodothyronine has 3 iodines. T4, tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine, has 4 iodines, right? So you need iodine to make these hormones, right? And thyroid gland, they allow your cells to have energy, really. So it increases the oxygen consumption in your cells. It increases the ATP production in your cells. It increases red blood cell synthesis so you can carry more oxygen, right? So it does a lot for metabolism. It increases the metabolism of all cells in your body, essentially. You got to remember, though, that the target cell, right? So when T3, T4 binds to that target cell is going to have a deiodinase, right? That deiodinase enzyme will be able to take iodine from T4 to make it T3. T3 is going to be that active hormone that can produce or increase the metabolism in the body, right? So it's good, right? It's essential for your growth and metabolism, basically. Now, let me just talk about the calcitonin for a second as well, because it's on the screen, okay? Calcitonin is also a hormone that's produced by the thyroid gland, C thyrocytes. I'll write that down, C thyrocytes. Or those clear cells. C means clear, really. It's a clear cell. It's an extrafollicular cell, so it's outside of the follicle, really. Whereas T3, T4, they're made in the follicle, okay? And they're produced in that follicle space or that colloid space. So these are those hormones, right? The T3, T4, these are hormones that are made extracellularly, so outside of a cell, okay? Getting back to the C thyrocytes, the clear cells, that's going to make calcitonin. So you can just think about it as it's going to tone down the amount of calcium in the blood, right? So it's there to reduce calcium blood levels, okay? Got to remember that. Obviously, understand the opposite hormone too, okay? So let me take that out. And let's talk about that opposite hormone of calcitonin. And that's going to be located, I'm going to draw these little 3 dots. Now we're looking at a posterior view of the thyroid gland. And that's going to be the parathyroid. The parathyroid glands will produce parathyroid hormone, PTH. PTH will be released when you have low calcium, right? So PTH will basically stimulate an increase in calcium in the blood. Okay, so that'll make you reabsorb the calcium from your kidneys, right? Reabsorb more calcium from your intestinal tract. Okay, so we can increase the amount of calcium in the blood. So you gotta remember calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Okay, wanted to mention that. Going back simply to the thyroid gland and its disorders, right? So remember hyperthyroidism, right? Is too much thyroid gland production, basically, right? So you're making a lot of T3, T4, right? Going out to the body. You can have too much iodine, right? You can have, or Graves' disease, which would be characterized by hyperthyroidism, right? But if you're making a lot, that could still lead to a goiter, right? And now looking at hypothyroidism, right? Too little, right? T3, T4 being made, and that's Hashimoto's disease, right? So that can mainly be due to really not having a lot of thyroid or having enough iodine or having any iodine in your diet, really. And so, your hypothalamus is stimulating that anterior pituitary to then stimulate the thyroid gland. So remember, TRH goes down to stimulate TSH production. TSH production stimulates T3, T4. But if you're having right? Low. T3, T4, which is characterized by hypothyroidism. This feedback loop is going to go up to stimulate the hypothalamus and to stimulate the pituitary gland. And so that pituitary gland is going to continue to release TSH, 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 constantly stimulating, right, T3, T4 production. But again, if you don't have any iodine, that stimulation of that thyroid gland is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so as a result, that'll also result in a goiter. So both hyper and hypothyroidism can result in a goiter. Okay, and I'll let you look at these lab results too that you can see for the different diseases. Okay, so now let me change gears and talk about the adrenal gland for a second, right? Excuse me. So the adrenal gland, so I'm going to draw an adrenal gland for a second. Okay, in the middle we have the adrenal medulla. Let me just talk about the medulla first, right? That's the adrenal medulla. Remember that it's going to be the adrenal medulla that's going to make the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, okay? And the norepinephrine. Okay, so you got to remember that about the adrenal medulla. Now, I'm going to talk about the adrenal cortex. So, the outermost layer of the adrenal cortex, remember what that's called? That's going to be called the zona glomerulosa. The zona glomerulosa will produce mineralocorticoids such as aldosterone. Remember, it's a type of mineral corticoid. Okay, gotta remember that. Also want you to remember that middle layer, which we talk about a lot. That middle layer is going to produce those glucocorticoids such as cortisol. And remember, it is a glucocorticoid because it's going to have something to do with glucose, maintaining glucose concentrations, really. Okay, so you can think of it like that. And then, of course, the innermost layer is going to be the zona reticularis, and that's going to produce those androgens, right? The testosterone, things like that. Okay, so we got to remember what each layer will produce. Okay, now also I want you to remember the types of diseases too that can come from the adrenal gland. Okay, so let me erase that. Okay, and so we have Cushing's disease. That's when you have too much adrenal cortex hormones. Okay, overstimulation, right, of those adrenal cortex hormones, too much steroid hormones in the body, basically. Okay, and that's when, remember, we talked about like that moon face, right? That's going to be characterized by the Cushing's disease, right? Extra adipose fat around the belly, around the back, having that buffalo hump, essentially. Okay, some weight gain. Okay. You can also have hypertension too, right? If you're producing a lot of that aldosterone, right? Conserving all that sodium staying in the body, and that's going to produce hypertension. Of course, when we look at Addison's disease, a little less common though, right? Addison's disease is where we have hypo secretion of the adrenal cortex hormones, essentially, right? That could be like an infection of the adrenal glands. Maybe you don't have, they're removed, right? So that could lead to Addison's disease. Okay. And I also want to finish talking about the RAS system, right? A quick run through of the RAS system. So remember, what is the stimulus that's going to start this RAS system? The stimulus is basically a drop in blood pressure. A drop in blood pressure will stimulate the release of renin. All right. So when we looked at it in the lab, remember we had the oh Lord, that's a kidney. Okay. These are your lungs. And then that should be an easy one. That's your adrenal gland. Okay. And so obviously I'm going to draw, oh Lord, that's a liver. Again, this RAS system will get stimulated when you have a drop in blood pressure. Now, let's look at it for a second. When you have a drop in blood pressure, you most likely will have a drop in blood volume, meaning you don't have that much fluid in your vessels, right? So that's going to be able to drop your blood pressure. So the liver will produce an enzyme or a protein, I should say, called angiotensinogen, right? It's ogen, so it's inactive. Okay. When your kidneys actually have that stimulus, when they understand that there's a drop in blood pressure, your kidneys will release renin. Renin will convert that angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 will circulate in the bloodstream, comes across the lungs. The lungs have this enzyme. Remember what the lungs have? It's called ACE. Right? I'll write it over here. ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. It's going to convert, right? So it's going to convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, right? And it's angiotensin 2 that we really want, okay? And so angiotensin 2 will then stimulate the adrenal glands to release aldosterone. If we stimulate the release of aldosterone, let's look at this. You increase your sodium reabsorption in your kidneys. Thus, you're going to increase your water reabsorption. And if you increase your water reabsorption, you're going to increase your blood volume, which will means you're going to increase your blood pressure, right? Angiotensin 2 is a powerful vasoconstrictor, so that increases blood pressure as well. Angiotensin 2 will go up to the brain, the hypothalamus, and stimulate thirst, right? You bring in more fluids, that increases your blood volume, that increases your blood pressure. It also goes up to the hypothalamus too and tells it to release ADH. ADH is going to be sent down to the kidneys to conserve fluid volumes, conserve that water. You conserve your water, you increase your blood volume, you increase your blood pressure, right? And we'll talk about the other effects that it will have, but this is just a basic overview of the RAS system, okay? Remember, it gets stimulated when you have a drop in blood pressure. You have a drop in blood pressure, the kidneys will recognize that, release renin. Renin will convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 goes to the lungs, gets converted via angiotensin converting enzyme into angiotensin 2, right? Angiotensin 2 does all the main effects, right? Stimulating the release of aldosterone, right? Constricting your peripheral blood vessels to increase blood pressure, stimulating thirst, stimulating the release of ADH, right? All these things that will help to do the opposite of that initial stimulus and increase blood pressure. That's the overall results. Okay? Happy study.